Reactions have continued to trail the decision of the regulator of university admissions in Nigeria to give institutions a free hand in determining the quality of candidates to admit. The Joint Admissions and Matriculation Board, JAMB, had last week cancelled general cut-off marks for admission to tertiary institutions and allowed them freedom to set their individual benchmark for admissions. However, some analysts have said the decision could further lower the quality of education in Nigeria, while others disagree. Well, joining us to share his perspective on the new admissions policy is Chineye Mba-Uzoukwu, an education analyst. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
And by the way, I hope I said your name right.
You did a good job.
Thank you very much. So let's start with your perspective on this new policy. What are your thoughts? What are your initial thoughts? Take us through what your mind is thinking at the moment.
I think, to be honest, I think Jamb'S is getting a lot of bashing for the wrong reasons. And a part of it has to do with communication and our clarity in terms of what it is, that Jamb'S is actually all about. And a part of it is also the layers upon years and years of misconceptions around what Jamb'S is and what it does. And it's quite simple, really. When you understand that there are different stakeholders in the education space, tertiary education space, and this examination is a unified matriculation exam, right, for tertiary education. So it has the NUC, for example. It has the MBTE and itself, and other stakeholders reaching decisions around how to manage the sector. What's Jamb'S role? 20, 30, 40 years ago, there were fewer universities, fewer students. So the universities could set their individual entrance exams, and candidates would choose which university they wanted to go to. If you went to school 30, 40 years ago in Nigeria, no, 40, 50 years ago, I should say, because Jamb'S came in about 40 years ago, you would choose the universities you wanted to go to with your parents. You would apply, and you would they would announce the dates for the exams. If the dates clashed, you would miss one. If the dates were separate, you could actually attend different university entrance exams. And the universities would then test you and decide on who they want to admit. As the population increased, the number of universities increased, the demanding for seats also increased. There became a mismatch, a huge mismatch between the number of candidates and the number of available spaces in the universities. There was also more complication in terms of these examinations, because you would have to choose, let's say you wanted to go to ABU, and it was taking the exam was the same day as Unilag. You wouldn't have a choice.
Yes.
So the students who wanted to study, the students were actually constrained in terms of the choices, and the universities themselves were losing out on the opportunities. Because if I took the exam for UNN or ABU and let go of Unilag, and I didn't get into ABU or UNN, Unilag is not going to set a separate test for me to come and do a supplementary test to fill in the quota. So quotas were missing. The universities had quotas. They were not filling them up. The students were being constrained in terms of their choices. So the logical decision was to create a unified system that allowed everyone to come literally into some kind of a marketplace. The universities come with their admissions and the admission requirements and the vacancies that they have. The students, on the other hand, working with their parents, choose what universities they want to go to, what courses they want to study, and you take one exam. What that means is that you have a pool of students taking an exam. Let's say to enter, they're taking this exam, they want to study medicine. So there are 1 million Jamb'S examines between 1.5 and 1.7 million students every year. The available spaces in the universities are about 600 to 700,000, which means that there's a surplus of candidates for the number of seats. How do you decide? The solution is simple. You take a ranking. Take a ranking examination. You say, of the 1.5 million students who are taking this exam for the available 700 spaces, go take an exam, and the results of that exam will rank you in a way that allows the universities to then say, we want to take people from this level to this level for this particular course, or from this level to this level for this particular course. The universities retain the autonomy in terms of choosing the students that they want, but now there's a ranking system. They can now tell. And most importantly, choice is now brought to the table of the parents and the students, because now they have one exam. They don't have to forego any option. And that's how JAMB came into being. And so what you're seeing is people confusing JAMB with an achievement examination or a qualifying examination. WAEC is a qualifying examination. Every child who has 5 credits in WAEC should be able to get into, is a candidate to get into a university. Whether the university takes that person or not is a different story. So I'm University of Lagos. I have all these students who want to come to me. University of Lagos will probably get typically 70,000 students, right, who are shortlisted based on their criteria and their cutoff marks. They can only admit 30,000 or 33,000. So how do they make the choice? If you don't have a Jamb, you don't have that ranking, how do they make the choice? And that's why I think there's a bit of confusion. People are kind of like conflating the things and imagine a Jamb is an assessment exam or an achievement exam, whereas what it just does is ranking. And that's the first point of confusion. Once you take that off the table, it becomes clear that this question of cutoff marks is actually really a non-issue. From a Jamb perspective, it's really not an issue.
And if I may come in, Chineye, even before now, before this cutoff mark scenario, we've had places whereby there have been designated so-called educationally disadvantaged regions. For example, in the north, you have a scenario whereby that law might not be that applicable. You find students who don't make the cutoff marks and still able to get into institutions, even beyond their region. So it's like you said, it's not new, but we're seeing it at a lower level on that perspective. So what do you have to say to that?
I'm laughing because, as is typical in Nigeria, you have to separate the politics from the professional thing.
Yeah.
So what's the right thing to do? If you have, for historical reasons, any part of a country or any population, it's not just geography, it's also socioeconomic status, right? For example, a child who comes from a poor home would not have early childhood. And if you don't have early childhood, then the child goes into basic education, which is primary, with a disadvantage, right? And that handicap may never actually pick up. So this child will get to a certain stage where he or she should be able to compete with anybody else, but due to socioeconomic circumstances, the child is disadvantaged. Would society not ask that this child should be given a better opportunity? Because intelligence and genius doesn't sit with a particular color, a particular ethnicity, a particular socioeconomic status. You can have the smartest child in the world coming from an extremely poor background. The goal of our education sector must be to ensure the right to education for every single child. So how do we deal with issues of educational disadvantage? And when you take it into Jamb, it becomes very confusing to people. So let's look at it this way. You rank the students through the Jamb exam. You pass that to the universities. They decide on who they want to bring into their system. If a university decides it wants to bring in people, and let's also be very clear about this other point. Universities have always been the ones to submit the cutoff marks. Jamb doesn't sit in a room and then decide on the cutoff mark. That's not what happens. What happens is that a quota for every faculty and every department, every course of study for every single university is established by a joint committee. The university working with Jamb, working with the NUC, who does the accreditation, because it's NUC that accredits a university and licenses it to operate in the first instance, not Jamb. So you set a quota, right? That's the first step. Then they then say, for this year, for the Faculty of Law, we are looking at a cutoff mark of 180. They transmit that letter to Jamb. Jamb collects all those letters. So it's a university that says, this is what is our cutoff mark for this particular course. What used to happen before this latest thing was that all those cutoffs would come to Jamb. Jamb would collate, and they would hold a meeting, a stakeholders meeting, where all of the vice chancellors, all the rectors, all the provosts would be there. And they would establish what was the highest, what was the lowest, and then they will agree on a common cutoff through a process of discussion and negotiation and thinking about what is best for Nigeria, what's best to ensure that we fill in the universities, because the universities usually, the university, at the end of the day, the quota is hardly ever met. It's hardly ever, I don't think the quota has been met in the last 20 years.
Okay. Wow.
Right? So it is always a shortfall. Mm-hmm. So you have a quota that you set, but you never get enough students. Mm-hmm. So then they sit and they put that cutoff mark. So what they're saying this time, we will not normalize it and give you a bottom line. You, the university, you wrote us a letter saying you want 180. Well, go ahead and admit at 180. The university can say, well, ideally we should have 300, but we're getting 180. In order to fill up our classes, be sure that our lecturers are actually working with students. They have a full classroom to ensure that they use the facilities for which are going to be paid anyway. We want to fill up that number. Now, the onus is now on the university to say, we've admitted at 180, not the 220 that we are targeted for. What do we need to do? to lift these students, knowing that they have come in at 180, whereas we targeted 220. It doesn't change the fact that they have already qualified with their 5 credits. Jamb's role, Jamb cannot go back to secondary school to go and start training. And I always ask parents this question.
Yeah.
Would you prefer that your child passes Jamb in flying colors but fails WAEC? It's just a test. People can sit down and study Jamb and pass Jamb extraordinarily well. Does that make them intelligent? Does it mean that they actually know what it is that they're...
So let me clarify then, with all of the things that we've said at the moment and some of the points that you've highlighted, you've talked about ranking, you've talked about quota, you've talked about, I think you've also echoed the fact that WAEC is really the key, the WAEC results is really the key. But in terms of the cutoff marks, and back to Jamb,
yes.
Are you saying that because one of the key points of argument is that it lowers the quality of education in the country, are you saying that that's...
How does it lower the quality of education?
You're the expert, so we need your input.
People have this impression and they say these things, right? But they don't bother to kind of like follow the sequence through.
True. Okay.
So again, let's go back. Let's leave the politics out of it and all that stuff and just talk about the reality. This country is 60% youth, correct? Which means that there are something between 80 and 110 million people who need to go to school every single day. It's 110, 120 million people who need to be in a classroom in school every single day. Just think about that. Think about the fact that you actually have the total enrollment in tertiary institutions in Nigeria today is under 2 million, 1% of our population. Think about the fact that every single year, Jamb examines 1.7 million people, 1.5 to 1.7, and admits between 500 and 700,000. Where are all those other people going to? We should ask ourselves, what happens to those people? Are we condemning them to a certain level of education? Or as a society, do we have a responsibility to think to ourselves, what do we do? Is it required for us to think about this degree and to think about whether we should focus on expanding our capacity in the polytechnics or in the colleges of education? You see, if a person has gone through the 6-3-3-4 system, finishes the final 6, and is at that stage of their life, 18 to 21 years old, and cannot get a slot in a university because there is a limited capacity in the universities, limited capacity, what happens to that person? Our society has to be conscious and responsible in thinking about what happens to those. So I'm going to come back to just to tie it into this bottom line.
Right.
When we say reduce the quality of education, the issue is this. The people who can get through will get through. The universities, even if you put the cutoff marks at 200, or you put the cutoff marks, let's say we want a really smart society. We say, all right, Jamb, we look at Jamb as more than a ranking exam. Yeah. We say it's 300 or nothing, right? 300 or nothing. In India, for example, I was in India in 2013 or so, the results came out, right, for admission to universities. It was 100% that you needed to score to get into university.
I'm sorry to have to come in at this rate, Chineye Mba-Uzoukwu, but I'd like to thank you very much for your input on that. We've just run out of time. All right, so very moving insight.